There is a plant growing wild across North America and Europe right now that contains 4 times more calcium per gram than cow's milk. The same plant produces leaves with a protein content, when dried, of 25 to 30% dry weight, higher than spinach, higher than kale, higher than any leafy green most people have ever purchased. Archaeological teams working in Denmark found this plant woven into fabric dating to 1,500 years before the Common Era. Textile historians examined those Bronze Age samples and described them as among the finest plant-based material from that entire era. The plant costs nothing. It regrows every time you cut it. And at some point in the last 70 years, the Western world collectively stopped knowing it was edible. This is stinging nettle, Urtica dioica. Human beings have been eating it, wearing it, and treating illness with it for at least 3,500 years. And in most of the Western world today, people pull it out of the ground and throw it away. It is February, the Scottish Highlands. The stored food from autumn is nearly gone. In the doorway of a stone cottage, a woman pulls on her heaviest gloves before stepping outside. The ground is still hard, the sky offers nothing, but at the base of the stone wall, where the soil stays slightly warmer, something is pushing through. Thin green shoots, no taller than a hand's width, edged with the fine hairs that will raise welts on bare skin within seconds of contact. She harvests them carefully, filling her apron, carrying them back to the fire. Into boiling water they go. 60 seconds, no more. The sting disappears completely. What remains is a dark, earthy green, soft and mineral-rich, that goes into the pot with whatever else the family has. This is not a story about poverty as deprivation. This is a story about knowledge as survival. The ethnobotanical record of the Scottish and Irish Highlands documents nettle as the first edible green of the year, arriving in February and early March, weeks before any garden crop was viable. Rural communities across both regions ate it in soups, in porridges, pressed into flatbreads. They did not eat it because it was available, they ate it because they understood what it contained. That understanding was not written down. It was handed across a fire, season by season, for generations. The Scottish Highlands were not where this knowledge began. In Denmark, circa 1,500 years before the Common Era, Bronze Age communities were harvesting stinging nettle not for food, but for fiber. The plant's hollow stems, processed and spun, produce a thread comparable in strength and fineness to linen. Archaeological excavations recovered burial shrouds and garments woven from nettle fiber. Textile analysts who examined these samples noted deliberate selection. These communities chose nettle because of what it produced, not because nothing else was available. By the 1st century of the Common Era, the knowledge had moved south. Pliny the Elder documented stinging nettle in Naturalis Historia, completed approximately 77 CE, recording its use for joint inflammation and respiratory conditions. Alongside the botanical record, a physical practice was already established across the Roman world: urtication, the deliberate application of fresh stinging nettle leaves to arthritic limbs. The sting triggered circulation. Practitioners reported relief. The method was considered standard enough to document, not remarkable enough to debate. 1,500 years later, a modern industrial nation would be forced to remember it all. In the late summer of 1914, the British naval blockade severed Germany's primary cotton supply routes. Within 2 years, the German military faced a textile shortage that threatened its capacity to clothe its own forces. The government's response was not to find another imported fiber. It was to organize a nationwide nettle harvest. Schools mobilized. Civilian populations were enlisted. German army uniforms were produced from nettle fiber while the war continued. The program is documented in German state records. A modern industrial nation, pushed to its absolute limit, turned back to a plant that European communities had relied on for 2,000 years. When the war ended and cotton returned, the program stopped. The knowledge did not vanish overnight, it simply became unnecessary. And unnecessary knowledge, passed down with less urgency each generation, eventually stops being passed down at all. Stinging nettle was never outlawed. No legislation named it, no campaign targeted it directly. What happened was structural, and in many ways more effective than any outright suppression could have been. In 1915, the National Dairy Council was established. By the time American federal dietary guidelines were being written, the council had 4 decades of presence, established relationships with federal agricultural policy, significant funding directed toward nutritional research, and a well-developed infrastructure for placing that research into schools, hospitals, and government programs. In 1943, the USDA introduced the Basic 7 Food Guide. Wartime priorities shaped it. So did the agricultural relationships that had been building since 1915. In 1956, the Basic 4 replaced it. One entire food group, exclusive, standalone, was dedicated to dairy. 2 to 4 servings daily, positioned as a cornerstone of healthy eating for every American. The message that infrastructure delivered, consistently and for decades, was this: calcium comes from dairy. Strong bones require dairy. Children need milk to grow. Milk is a good source of calcium. That is not in dispute. What the independent science did not broadly support was the claim that dairy was the essential, primary, or most reliable calcium source available. What the record shows is that one industry had 4 decades of established federal presence at the exact moment those guidelines were being written, significant research funding, and direct access to the institutional channels that shaped what Americans understood about nutrition. Walter Willett, professor of epidemiology at Harvard and one of the most cited nutritional researchers in the world, addressed this directly in his 2001 book, Eat, Drink, and Be Healthy. He argued that the USDA food pyramid was shaped more by agricultural interests than by the weight of nutritional evidence, and that decades of sustained industry influence had distorted American understanding of calcium requirements. That is not a fringe position. That is a Harvard public health researcher with 40 years of evidence making a documented institutional critique. Nobody had to name stinging nettle. Nobody had to run a campaign against wild plants. When an industry spends decades making one answer to a nutritional question feel like the only answer, every other answer quietly disappears from the conversation on its own. Return to the plant itself, because the documented science is not subtle. The USDA nutritional database places fresh stinging nettle at approximately 480 milligrams of calcium per 100 grams. Whole milk registers at 113 milligrams per 100 grams. The honest caveat is that nettle contains oxalates, compounds that bind to minerals and reduce absorption rates. Milk carries an absorption advantage through its lactose content and added vitamin D. The raw calcium number does not translate 1-to-1. What the record also shows is that nettle's oxalate content is measurably lower than spinach and beet greens, both of which are routinely recommended as calcium sources without qualification. Blanching reduces oxalates further. The net nutritional picture remains strong. The most significant clinical finding in the nettle record concerns inflammation. Compounds in stinging nettle have been shown in peer-reviewed research to inhibit NF-kappa B, a molecular signaling pathway central to the inflammatory response in human tissue. This is the same pathway targeted by several major pharmaceutical anti-inflammatory drugs. The mechanism is not disputed. It appears consistently across the literature. On urtication, the practice Pliny documented in 77 CE, a double-blind trial published in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine in 2000 tested patients with arthritis at the base of the thumb. One group applied fresh, stinging nettle topically. The control group applied identical-looking leaves with no active compounds. The nettle group reported significantly reduced pain. a traditional practice considered extreme by modern standards, held up under controlled clinical examination. On prostate health, multiple randomized control trials published in peer-reviewed urology journals compared nettle root extract against finasteride, the standard pharmaceutical treatment for benign prostatic hyperplasia. One study following more than 600 patients found that over 80% of the nettle group reported meaningful symptom improvement across the trial period. These are not preliminary findings. These are multi-hundred patient trials showing a plant from roadside ditches producing outcomes comparable to a prescription drug for one of the most common conditions affecting men over 50. A single established nettle plant, managed through a growing season, produces multiple harvests. The first flush arrives in February or March in most temperate zones, weeks before most garden vegetables are viable. Harvest the young growing tips when the plant reaches 6 to 12 inches, cut the top third. Within 7 to 10 days, new shoots emerge from the lower nodes. Cut those. The cycle repeats from early spring through first frost. Once the plant begins to flower in late spring, cut it entirely to the ground. It regrows from the root system and delivers another flush of young harvestable leaves within weeks. One plant, one growing season, managed with regular cutting, continuous fresh greens for the better part of 8 months. The preparation is not complicated. Blanch fresh leaves in boiling water for 60 seconds. The trichomes collapse. The sting is gone. What remains handles exactly like cooked spinach, darker, earthier, slightly more mineral in flavor. Nettle soup has been made in Scotland and Ireland for centuries. Onion, potato, stalk, blenched nettle leaves, blended smooth. 4 ingredients. Nothing exotic, nothing purchased. Dried nettle powder carries no sting risk at all and goes directly into soups, broths, or prepared foods without any processing step. The nutritional profile of stinging nettle was never classified. The ethnobotanical record of its use across dozens of cultures was never sealed. The clinical research has been accumulating in peer-reviewed journals for decades. The Bronze Age Danes knew what the plant produced. Pliny documented it in 77 CE. Highland families ate it through February when nothing else grew. A modern industrial nation clothed its military with it during a world war. None of that knowledge was destroyed. So what does it mean that a plant with a 3,500-year documented record of feeding, clothing, and treating entire civilizations became within a single generation something the Western world pulls out of the ground and discards, not because the record was hidden, but because a louder and far better funded conversation simply crowded it out? The suppression was not total. It never reached everywhere. In the hill communities of rural Nepal, stinging nettle never left the kitchen. Sisnu kojol, nettle soup, remains an active, named, practiced preparation documented in ethnobotanical research and in food security literature covering subsistence communities across the Himalayan foothills. Urtica dioica and its regional relative Urtica parviflora are harvested from wild growth, prepared fresh, and eaten as a regular part of the diet in communities where the industrial food conversation never arrived with enough force to replace what people already knew. This is not a historical artifact. It is a living practice in a named, documented community. The knowledge did not die. It survived in the places where no one came to replace it with something you could buy instead. In order to grow this plant, you do not need land. You do not need a foraging guide. You need one entry point. Source dried stinging nettle leaf from Mountain Rose Herbs, Oregon Department of Agriculture certified organic, documented sourcing standards, verifiable supply chain. Order the dried leaf, not a capsule, not an extract, the leaf. Steep 2 teaspoons in boiling water for 10 minutes. That is nettle tea. Mild, earthy, the same preparation Highland families made from the first green thing that pushed through frozen ground every February. If the plant is already growing on your property, and in most of North America and Europe it is, you already have the source. gloves, 60 seconds of boiling water, and the knowledge of what you are holding. The plant at the fence line was never the problem. The problem was the noise that made you stop looking at it. The knowledge was never destroyed. It was simply outspent. This is before industry, an ongoing investigation into what was replaced, by whom, and what it cost. The next report goes into something 1,000 years older than the American mushroom industry, a cultivation method Chinese mountain farmers mastered on dead wood and thyme, that one industry spent 50 years wrapping in manufactured complexity to make you believe you could not do it yourself. If this investigation is the kind of record you want to stay inside, subscribe. The next report is already in progress.